prequels have quite the reputation for being worse in quality than the main series it's derived off of. This most certainly doesn't speak to everything, but there definitely isn't a shortage of poorly received prequels. There are those gems that do become successful though, even more so than the main series sometimes. So what exactly is it that separates a successful prequel from a failed one? Although I can't necessarily answer that question, I will discuss it. In order to try to find the differences between these kind of prequels, let's look at history. Star Wars Episodes 1 through 3 are probably some of the most popular prequel movies that were generally poorly received by fans. On the other end of the spectrum, Metal Gear Solid 3 and 5 are some of the most well-received games in the series by fans. We'll be using these examples for now, but only because I think these series are good examples of how prequels are generally received. Also keep in mind that I'll be calling Naked Snake Big Boss for the sake of avoiding possible confusion with Solid Snake. Now I know I'm comparing a gaming series with a movie series, but I think Metal Gear Solid's reception is generally a reflection on its story, not necessarily the gameplay, so I think it's still a reasonably fair comparison. Also, spoilers for the Star Wars prequels and the basic premise in Metal Gear Solid 3 will be discussed. I'll try to keep the spoilers to Metal Gear Solid 3 at a minimum, but if you read too much into my statements, you may end up being spoiled. The story for the original Metal Gear and Metal Gear 2 will also be spoiled. One of the main differences, I think, between Star Wars and Metal Gear Solid prequels is how they approach their main storyline. Character growth. In Star Wars prequels, they have a lot of setup for the next movies to come. We see Anakin grow into Darth Vader, and even then we only see that growth more in the third movie. So what we end up with are movies that go over Anakin's personal story to be set up in a way that isn't just canon with the later movies, but is setting up specifically for them. In Metal Gear Solid 3, on the other hand, we see through the eyes of Big Boss. He's also a villain in the main series, however it's much different because he's more just a unique character who ends up being a villain. I think they're different in this regard. One character is being set up to be a villain, while the other is growing as his own unique character who happens to end up as a villain. I personally think the main issue with the first two Star Wars prequels is that they don't feel like natural growth. Anakin isn't growing as Vader, but rather he's growing into Vader, and only so at the end of the prequel trilogy. With Big Boss, on the other hand, he's already a unique individual with his own personality that grows. It doesn't feel like a big shift in character with Big Boss, but rather a logical continuation to his own personality. Both characters change over time and end up with large changes to their personality, but the road to getting there is, in my opinion, less logical and more sudden with Anakin. I'm not saying that a sudden shift in personality couldn't work. In fact, it arguably does work like that toward the end of Metal Gear Solid 3, but we have to be able to understand the character and connect with him so that it makes sense to us as the viewers. I can't speak for all viewers, of course, but I think older fans of the series probably had a hard time connecting with Anakin at any point, whether that be him changing throughout the movies or him changing into a villainous character there towards the end. With Big Boss, on the other hand, things happen very gradually, and after certain betrayals and knowing who he's working for and who he's trying to kill a bit better, he gradually becomes a relatable character due to those experiences. We go through those experiences as well as he does, not because it's a game, but because of how we can imagine what it's like to be that character. With Anakin, however, I'm not so sure that can be said. Another point of contrast is when these prequels were released relative to their main series titles. Star Wars Episode 1 came out 16 years after Episode 6, while there was only 3 years of separation between Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3. This could have been a big factor for why Star Wars prequels were so poorly received. The prequels may have been targeting a specific demographic, probably the teen one, while the main series didn't seem to target anyone in particular. At least that's how I look at it. I may be wrong here, but even if I am, there's a large gap in time with the Star Wars movies, meaning that the people who are introduced to the series through those movies are different in age, and the people who are returning to the series are just that much older. Now this isn't applicable anymore, of course, being 2017, but I think that may have been the main reasoning behind why the two series seemed, at the time, so different from each other, referring to the main series and the prequel series. Time also changes how CGI looks, which actors are available, how they're able to be used, and more. Overall, if you're making a prequel, I think it's decent to say it's not best to wait for over a decade and a half, at least on the more technical side of things, if nothing else. Metal Gear Solid 3, on the other hand, didn't take very long to come out in comparison to its latest main entry, Metal Gear Solid 2. This even allows the use of the same voice actors for similar characters to the main series. Another thing regarding time is when these titles take place throughout the series. In the Star Wars timeline, we go through Anakin's eyes, a character who persists throughout the main series. Going from Episode 3 to 4 takes roughly 20 years in the timeline. The reason why I mention this is because we're missing out on Anakin's character in those 20 years. It may not be a big issue, but Metal Gear Solid 3 is just an entirely different portrayal. The difference between Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3 is a massive, approximately 45 years in the timeline. You may think that would be worse, because we'd be missing out even more on the main character. But the approach is actually very different. Unlike with Star Wars, we see the main character change. In fact, this is the first time where the main character is Big Boss instead of Solid Snake or Raiden. One could definitely argue that Luke is the main character in Episode 4 through 6 due to him being the protagonist and all, and they would probably be right. However, we still see Darth Vader as a huge character throughout Episode 4 through 6. This means that we're better able to understand Darth Vader and arguably don't need to know his background as much. Big Boss, on the other hand, is in Metal Gear 1 and 2, and only as a villain in those for a short period of time, and we're given little information about him. The fact that we go from that to 45 years in the past, we're able to see Big Boss and the game fills in the mysteries of his life. We're able to see a background of a character that we don't know very well, but know on a basic level. This also helps make his stories as well. There's nothing in Metal Gear Solid 3 that would make a fan say, oh, that doesn't fit his character, because we don't know his character well enough to, based off of Metal Gear 1 and 2, to be able to say that. He's mysterious enough for this game to work as well as it does from a story standpoint. Due to how old they are in the timeline, we're able to see certain character relationships throughout these prequels. Due to how old they are in the timeline, we're able to see certain character relationships throughout the Star Wars prequels, as well as Metal Gear Solid 3. We're able to see Obi-Wan and how he interacts with Anakin. We're able to see Ocelot and how he interacts with Big Boss. We're even able to see Eva before she makes an appearance in a future game. We see both recurring characters and brand new ones with new relationships. Let's start with romance. In Star Wars, Anakin and Padme have a romantic relationship and it gets involved with the plot. It's a romance that is heavily gone over for a pretty long amount of time throughout the movies, especially Episode 2. Metal Gear Solid 3, on the other hand, has a romantic relationship, but it's not as much a lover's quarrel as it is a relationship that's more about the two characters' love they have for each other, as well as the plot that they both have to deal with. Both characters are respected in the story, having their own unique tales to tell, not just the main character. It's not at all that they don't sometimes disagree on things, but rather when they do, it has an actual impact on the story, not just the relationship between themselves or the main character's thoughts. And it does all of this with very little overall screen time in the game, or maybe the characters' interactions with each other were just better acted. Who knows? Another quick note is that there are many new characters in both the Star Wars prequels and Metal Gear Solid 3, yet it seems that Big Boss develops a relationship with not one or two, but a decent amount of these characters. Many of these are interesting, like in most Metal Gear Solid games. Not only this, but the part of the game that would be considered the climax of the story to most fans is a part that is made by developing a relationship between Big Boss and the brand new character. It becomes a part that is so important to most people that it's often looked at as the most emotional and best part of the series. In Star Wars prequels, on the other hand, there's very little interaction at all outside of Obi-Wan and Padme with regards to Anakin. If you're going to have a prequel, you have the benefit of being able to introduce many new characters and relationships due to them not intervening with the main plot later in the timeline. In my opinion, Metal Gear Solid 3 takes advantage of this, while Star Wars just sort of ignores the opportunity. A large amount of the overall plot in these two series regards politics.
Sokolov. They wanted us to return Sokolov.
Generally, politics is boring, so having it mentioned frequently is usually looked at as a bad thing. I do think there's a bit too much with regards to politics in Star Wars, but I think the main issue here is of its relevance to the story and its characters. I don't think most people ever cared much about the politics in Star Wars because it didn't affect Anakin or Obi-Wan much. On the other hand, Metal Gear Solid is practically built on politics regarding the military, and yet, fans generally love its story surrounding it. It's detailed and intricate, but more importantly, it directly affects the main characters and their relationships. It's always an important part of the Metal Gear franchise, but it's also treated like it's important. Because the politics are important in Metal Gear Solid, it's also important for the game to keep you on your toes in terms of story. Even though the politics never seem to overstay their welcome, they're always treated respectfully and are always shown more than they're talked about. There's a lot of talking, sure, but with plenty of visuals that continuously engage the player mentally to help them understand the politics and the effect it has on the main character, it never undermines the player's intelligence and is filled with many surprising and epic moments that, once again, affect the characters and their stories. It's generally very coherent and is how the plot can become so thick and full of plot twists. That's why people pay attention to it, not because it's politics, but because it affects the characters and their stories in interesting ways that always keeps the player on their toes. Star Wars' politics, on the other hand, always seem to be nothing but talk until the third movie, and even then, the action set pieces always appear to be entirely separate from the politics. It has a lot of talk about politics, but hardly ever shows it.
This is our last chance. Sokolov must have known.
The goal of Metal Gear Solid 3 is frequently known to the player, and because of this, we always feel like there's a point to things that are happening on screen. We're always trying to find a person or group. We know Big Boss's objective. The objectives and goals may change. We even see Big Boss struggle through some of these objectives, but we almost always have a goal that can't interfere with the canon because it's set so far in the past, it really can't interfere with the future plot. And when we don't have a goal, it doesn't matter because we're too invested in the personal stories at that point anyway. Now I want to ask you, in Star Wars, what's the main goal they set in the prequel trilogy? I sure don't know. I don't know whether it's because they didn't make it clear or because they were too focused on how to approach Anakin's story, but without an overall goal, it's probably more difficult for us to connect with the character and see his struggles throughout trying to complete his goals. It makes me ask, what's the point of all this in the first place? And the only answer I can come up with is to make Anakin become Darth Vader, which, in my opinion, isn't 6 hours worth, especially when there's no gameplay for the player to interact with. Another thing to point out with goals are the characters. What are the goals of each interesting character? Most of them in Metal Gear Solid 3 are intricate and logical. Most characters have a legitimate purpose and reasons for doing what they do, no matter what side they're on. Some of them arguably have more purpose and reasoning than the main character, which is why certain deaths are so heart-wrenching. In Star Wars prequels, on the other hand, you're usually not certain of a character's motives, or they're too simple to care about them as a character. Even Anakin, the main character, his motives after a while is to gain power to be able to protect certain people. Although you can build off of a character like this, I don't think they ever did so with Anakin. With Big Boss, on the other hand, his goals appear simple enough, still mysterious to us, however. They gradually change along with his character and grow just as he does. One of the things that can hold back a prequel story is the fact that you know what's going to happen with certain things. Star Wars and Metal Gear Solid have two different approaches to this. As a whole, I mentioned with what the point of it all is, Star Wars prepares the future by letting the main premise of the prequels be in preparation for episodes 4 through 6. It doesn't really allow for a new overarching story to kick in, as it's so focused on Anakin's transition to the dark side. In Metal Gear Solid 3, there's very little setup, and it's largely about the personal stories regarding what happened so long ago. There's setup, but even that is done well in my opinion. Ocelot, who, based off of other Metal Gear Solid titles, is a known operative who worked for Big Boss at one point. During Metal Gear Solid 3, you find out how. This is great because it's only a detail. It's never said that you'll be learning about their relationship. Up to that point, you're also never told how this relationship came to be or how it worked. You know that these characters need to live and eventually work together. You don't know much of anything else. This very well could have been left alone and never explained because of how old it is, but they went the extra mile to put in an added epic moment that you never really see coming. And I think that's a good way to put it in general. Keep in mind that I'm not saying that the Star Wars prequels were bad, but simply that I'm trying to find out why they were so poorly received. So with all that, let's quickly summarize some of the differences I noticed and how their approaches were different in an attempt to find out what makes a prequel good or bad. Character growth. Big Boss grew more slowly, thus arguably making him more personally relatable as he's taken through a much more intricate plot and betrayals. Anakin, on the other hand, grew in a more spastic manner. Trying to relate to him as a kid was difficult, and trying to relate to him at the important parts that made him turn dark were also difficult to relate to due to how sudden the change was. Time. The amount of time it took to go from the latest iteration of Metal Gear Solid to Metal Gear Solid 3 was only 3 years, allowing for the same actors and much less jarring changes in general, while being able to keep the same player base without much trouble. The amount of time it took to go from the latest iteration of Star Wars to Star Wars Episode 1 was 16 years, meaning that there were many technical changes that were more noticeable, and the changes in direction of story due to modern society probably ended up dividing the fan base a bit. Character relationships. Although important and treated with respect, Metal Gear Solid 3's character relationships always seemed to stay on screen only for as long as they had to, and ended up furthering the plot every time a relationship was also furthered. In Star Wars prequels, on the other hand, most character relationships either stayed on screen for too long, didn't further the plot enough, or both. I would say that the relationship between Anakin and Obi-Wan may have been the only exception to this. Politics. The politics in Metal Gear Solid 3 seem to always add to the story and action, while Star Wars does more talking than showing, making for a boring show that I can watch on the news if I wanted to. The goal. The goals of people and organizations in Metal Gear Solid are generally made clear, even if only by the very end of the game. In Star Wars, however, these can be unclear, without enough explanation, non-existent, or just bland. Preparing for the future. With Star Wars, the overall stories seem to be specifically there to set up for episodes 4 through 6, being guided by it and with little creative freedom outside of that, likely to prevent continuity issues or something. This leaves little room for new, different, and interesting stories or characters, while Metal Gear Solid 3 fully takes advantage of its timeline and introduces new and interesting characters while embracing future ones by having interesting backgrounds that we never expected. Both series can be interesting in their own rights. I'm curious to see if these same points would hold up with other prequels and how they're done. With all that said, thanks for watching, and remember to have fun.